He is dying of thirst. Who? The king of the world. Autumn 325 BC. The Gadrosian Desert. Imagine marching for 60 days across sand so hot it burns through leather sandals, where the nearest well is sometimes 3 days away, and where the wind erases your only path within hours. You have already conquered more of the known world than any man in history. You have never lost a battle, and now the thing that is killing your army is not an enemy soldier. It is a landscape with no water, no food, and no mercy. Keep moving. The coast is close. It is not close. It will not be close for weeks. Here's what almost nobody tells you about Alexander the Great. His most catastrophic defeat was not inflicted by the Persians, the Indians, or any army at all. It came from a decision he made himself, against the advice of the men who knew this land, and it would cost him more soldiers than any battle of his entire career. Stay with me for the next 40 minutes because I'm going to walk you through 9 decisions, mistakes, and turning points that explain how the most successful conqueror in ancient history nearly destroyed his own army in a stretch of sand most people today have never heard of. Point 4 is the moment where pride overruled every piece of good advice available to him. Point 7 is the detail that still makes historians uncomfortable 2,000 years later, because it reveals exactly how bad the miscalculation really was. And at the end, I will show you the exact number of men who walked into that desert and the number who walked out. Don't skip ahead. This story only makes sense in order. Point 1. Why a king who had already won everything still could not go home the easy way. To understand why Alexander marched into Gadrosia, you have to understand where he was standing in 325 BC, both geographically and politically. He had just finished a campaign in India that had gone further than any Macedonian force had ever traveled, past the Indus River, deep into Punjab, chasing a vision of reaching the edge of the world. Then, his own army stopped him. At the Hyphasis River, thousands of kilometers from home by the routes available at the time, his soldiers refused to go any further. Years of campaigning, monsoon rains, and endless marching had exhausted men who had followed him since Macedonia. For the first time in his life, Alexander faced a mutiny he could not fight his way out of. He had to turn back. But here is the important part, the part that explains everything that follows. Turning back was not simply a retreat. It was a political problem. Alexander needed to return to Persia and Mesopotamia looking like the undefeated king his reputation had built him into, not like a commander whose own troops had forced his hand. Every governor, every regional official, every rival back in Macedonia was watching to see whether his authority had cracked. Think about the position a business owner finds themselves in after a public failure they cannot fully hide. The need to project total control while privately scrambling to manage the fallout. That was Alexander's exact situation, except the stakes were an empire stretching from Greece to India, and the audience was every governor who might rebel the moment they sensed weakness. This single fact, that Alexander needed the return journey itself to look like a triumph, is the hidden cause of almost everything that went wrong next. Point 2. The empire's finances were not as stable as the map made them look. Here is something documentaries rarely spell out clearly. By 325 BC, Alexander's campaign had been running for 9 years. 9 years of paying soldiers, feeding an army that had swollen with reinforcements, camp followers, and captured wealth that needed transporting. Ancient historians describe a baggage train trailing behind the army that included not just soldiers, but merchants, wives, children, and enormous quantities of plunder collected across Persia and India. Feeding and paying a force of this size, likely somewhere between 60 and 120,000 people, counting soldiers and camp followers combined, required constant, reliable supply lines. Every additional month on campaign meant more gold spent, more grain consumed, more animals worked to exhaustion. I know what you are thinking right now. Alexander was rich beyond imagination. Why would money matter? Here is why that is the wrong question. Wealth and captured Persian treasure does not feed a soldier marching through a desert with no roads and no markets. Gold is worthless if there is nothing to buy with it for 300 miles in any direction. The empire's finances were enormous on paper and nearly frozen the moment the army left fertile, populated territory. Slow down here, because this is the mechanism behind almost every ancient military disaster, not just this one. An army does not starve because a kingdom is poor. It starves because supply lines fail at the exact moment they are needed most, and no amount of treasure in the strongbox fixes a wagon that cannot cross a sand dune. This is the same trap that destroys modern businesses with plenty of assets on paper and zero actual cash flow when a crisis hits. The empire looked unstoppable. The logistics were already stretched to breaking. Point 3. The plan that seemed reasonable on a map became a gamble with human lives in reality. Alexander's actual strategy was not reckless on its face. He split his forces into 3 groups. One column, led by his general Craterus, would take a safer, more established inland route, herding the wounded, the elderly, and the heaviest equipment. A second force, the fleet under his admiral Nearchus, would sail along the coastline, mapping the sea route and, crucially, resupplying the land force with food and water at agreed points along the shore. Alexander himself would lead the main army, likely tens of thousands of soldiers and camp followers, directly through the Gadrosian Desert, along the coast of what is now southern Iran and Pakistan. Here is the objection I know many of you are already forming. If he had a fleet supplying him by sea, how did anyone nearly starve? This is exactly the right question, and the answer is the single most important logistical failure in this entire story. The plan depended entirely on precise coordination between 2 forces moving through country neither had ever mapped, using seasonal winds that ancient sailors could predict only approximately. Nearchus's fleet was delayed for months by unfavorable winds before it could even leave harbor. By the time Alexander's land force needed resupply most desperately, the ships that were supposed to be waiting with food and water were nowhere near the coastline his officers expected. This is the exact moment every source of information Alexander had, his maps, his guides, his understanding of the terrain ahead, turned out to be wrong in ways that would cost thousands of lives before the march was finished. Point 4. The uncomfortable truth almost no one says directly. This is the point that makes people uneasy because it removes the myth and leaves only the man. Alexander did not choose the Gadrosian route because it was the safest option for his army. Ancient historians suggest he chose it at least partly because no army before his, not even the legendary Persian king Cyrus the Great, was believed to have successfully led a force through that exact desert and survived intact. Sit with that for a second. Don't scroll past this. The single most powerful military commander in the ancient world may have marched tens of thousands of soldiers and civilians into one of the most lethal environments on the continent, at least in part to prove a point about his own legend. Not for strategic necessity, not because it was the only path home, because it had never been done, and Alexander's entire identity was built on doing what had never been done. This is the same psychological trap that destroys leaders in every era, the moment personal legacy starts making decisions instead of sound judgment. A general who ignores his own scouts. A founder who will not abandon a doomed strategy because admitting failure feels worse than the actual risk of failure. Pride does not announce itself as pride. It disguises itself as ambition, as vision, as confidence, right up until the water runs out. And that is exactly where we are going next. In the next part, I will walk you through what actually happened once the army entered the desert. The heat that ancient writers describe as strong enough to scorch the ground itself. The moment supplies ran out faster than anyone predicted. And the detail about how soldiers died that even ancient historians recorded with visible discomfort. Stay with me. This is where the march stops being a strategic decision and becomes a story about what happens to human beings when every plan fails at once. Point 5. The march begins and the desert shows its true size. The army entered Gadrosia in the late summer heat of 325 BC, and within the first few days the terrain revealed something the maps had never captured. This was not simply dry land. It was an ocean of loose sand dunes, some rising high enough to swallow a marching column whole, where the wind constantly reshaped the ground beneath their feet. Ancient sources describe soldiers sinking to their knees with every step, the sand shifting under their sandals, as if the earth itself refused to hold them steady. The heat during the day climbed to levels that modern historians estimate could exceed 50 degrees Celsius on exposed sand, hot enough that metal armor left in the sun became too hot to touch. Soldiers who had crossed mountain passes in India, who had fought in monsoon rains, who had marched through Persian heat before, told each other this was different. This was not weather. This was a landscape actively working against them. Don't skip past this detail. Within the first week, the Army's water reserves, carefully rationed at the start, were already running dangerously low. The wells marked on Persian trade route descriptions, the ones Alexander's guides promised would appear every 2 or 3 days, were often dry, poisoned by salt, or simply not there at all. The guides themselves, local men hired to know this land, began admitting they had never personally traveled this deep into the interior. They knew the coastal routes. They did not know this. Here is the bridge you need before the next part. What started as a difficult march was quickly becoming something closer to a slow-motion catastrophe, and the officers around Alexander could see it happening in real time, even as the king pressed forward. Point 6. When the animals started dying, the humans knew they were next. The first deaths were not soldiers. They were the pack animals, the horses and mules carrying food, tents, weapons, and the wounded. Without enough water, these animals collapsed within days. Their bodies left where they fell because there was no time and no strength to bury them. Soldiers who had ridden the same horse for years watched it die in the sand and kept walking, because stopping meant falling behind, and falling behind in Gedrosia meant being left alone in a landscape with no landmarks and no mercy. Then came a decision that reveals exactly how desperate the situation had become. Ancient historians recorded that starving soldiers began killing and eating the pack animals that had not yet died from thirst. Animals that were supposed to carry supplies for the entire army, not feed it for a single desperate night. Every animal eaten meant less capacity to carry water and food for everyone still walking. It was a solution that solved today's hunger by guaranteeing tomorrow's. I know what some of you are thinking right now. Why didn't Alexander simply turn back once he saw how bad things were becoming? Here is why that option barely existed. By the time the true scale of the disaster was clear, retreating meant marching back across the same deadly stretch of sand the army had already crossed, through wells that were already drained, past landmarks that had already been picked clean of anything useful. Going forward was terrible. Going backward was almost certainly worse. Alexander was trapped by his own momentum, and so was everyone marching behind him. Slow down and sit with this next detail, because it is one of the moments ancient writers themselves seemed uncomfortable recording. As the march continued, the army began to fracture. Soldiers who could no longer keep pace fell behind the main column, and in the chaos of sandstorms and darkness, many were simply lost, left behind in a landscape that offered no way to find your way back to a group that was itself constantly moving. Historians estimate that a significant portion of the deaths in Gedrosia were not soldiers killed by heat or thirst directly, but people who became separated from the column and were never seen again. Point 7. The detail that still unsettles historians today. Here is the moment that changes how you see this entire march, the point I promised you at the beginning. Ancient sources, including the historian Arrian, writing centuries later using earlier accounts, describe something almost impossible to picture. The army did not just lose soldiers, it lost most of the camp followers, the women, the children, the merchants and craftsmen who had traveled with the army for years across Asia. These were not combat casualties. These were people who died walking, from thirst, from heat, from simple exhaustion, in numbers that ancient writers themselves struggled to state plainly. Modern historians estimate that of the tens of thousands of people who entered Gedrosia with Alexander, a substantial portion, quite possibly close to half by some estimates, did not emerge on the other side. Not all of these were killed in any dramatic sense. Most simply could not continue, sat down in the sand, and did not get back up. Stop here for a second. Do not scroll past this. This is not a story about a difficult battle with heavy losses. This is a story about a march where doing nothing wrong in any single moment could still end with your body left in the sand, because the entire system around you had already failed before you took your first step into the desert. The bridge to what comes next is this. Somewhere in the middle of this collapse, something happened that even Alexander's most loyal officers considered almost impossible to defend. A moment when the king who had built his identity on sharing every hardship with his men faced a test that had nothing to do with courage in battle and everything to do with a single cup of water. That is where we are going next. Stay with me, because this is the moment this march stops being about survival and becomes a story about what kind of leader Alexander actually was when no one was watching to record his legend. Point 8. The moment that changed how every soldier saw their king. Somewhere deep into the crossing, when officers and men alike had nearly given up hope of leaving the desert alive, a small group of scouts found something almost unbelievable. A tiny spring hidden in a dry ravine, holding barely enough water to fill a single helmet. These men had spent days watching companions collapse from thirst. Finding even this small amount felt to them like discovering treasure. They carried it back through the column as carefully as if it were gold and brought it straight to Alexander. Stop here for a second. Every soldier who saw this happen assumed they knew exactly what would come next. The king was as exhausted and as thirsty as any man in that army. Nobody would have blamed him for drinking it. Ancient accounts describe soldiers along the route stopping to watch, certain they were about to see their king take the only relief available to him. Alexander took the helmet in both hands. He thanked the men who had brought it to him. Then, in full view of the entire column, he tipped the helmet over and poured the water onto the sand. I know what some of you are thinking right now. Why would any leader waste the one thing his entire army was dying for? Here is why that single choice mattered more than any battle he had ever won. Alexander understood something that most people in power never learn. A man will follow someone who asks him to suffer, if that same man is willing to suffer exactly as much, in full view, with nothing held back for himself. According to the historian Arrian, the effect on the army was immediate and almost impossible to explain in ordinary terms. Soldiers who had been ready to lie down in the sand got back up and kept walking, as if they themselves had each taken a full drink from that helmet. Don't scroll past this. This is the detail that separates Alexander from almost every powerful figure in recorded history, then or now. He was, by every honest account, ruthless, arrogant, and often careless with the lives of the men who followed him. And yet in this one moment, stripped of armies and titles and conquered cities, he chose to go thirsty beside the lowest soldier in his ranks, rather than drink alone. That contradiction is not a footnote to his character. It is the character itself. Point 9. What survived the desert and what did not. The march through Gedrosia lasted roughly 60 days. When the army finally reached the region of Pura on the other side, the officers who tried to count the survivors were met with numbers that still unsettle historians today. Ancient and modern estimates vary because record-keeping in the ancient world was never exact, especially in the middle of a disaster. But the pattern across every source is the same. Of a combined force of soldiers and camp followers that may have numbered somewhere between 70 and 80,000 people at the start of the crossing, some estimates suggest as few as 15 to 20,000 walked out the other side. Even accounting for wide historical uncertainty, modern historians agree that Alexander likely lost more people to this single desert crossing than he lost in every major battle of his career combined. Sit with that number for a moment. This was not Gaza. This was not Tyre. There was no enemy general on the other side of this fight, no city walls to breach, no moment of triumph at the end that made the losses feel justified by victory. The desert did not care about strategy or glory. It simply took whoever could not keep walking, and it took them by the thousands. Here is the bridge to how this story ends. Alexander survived, his empire survived, and within 2 years he would be dead in Babylon, having never fully explained, even to the men closest to him, exactly why he chose that desert when a safer road had been sitting right there on the map. The march through Gedrosia is often left out of the popular version of Alexander's story, tucked away as a minor detour between the glory of India and the drama of his final days. But it may be the single moment that explains him more honestly than any battle he ever won. A commander brilliant enough to conquer most of the known world and proud enough to march tens of thousands of people into a desert mainly to prove that he could. He was not defeated by Darius. He was not defeated by any army that ever stood against him. The closest he ever came to losing everything was in a landscape with no walls, no weapons, and no enemy at all, except the one his own ambition led him into.